Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're looking at a piece of tech history that is honestly almost universally misunderstood. We are talking about Sony's MiniDisc. Okay, let's dive into this. When you hear the word MiniDisc, your brain probably jumps straight back to the 1990s, right? And you probably think of it as a massive, embarrassing flop. Just some weird, chunky piece of plastic that came and went in the blink of an eye, completely crushed by the CD and the MP3. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about this little disc is literally completely wrong? Despite the popular belief that it just crashed and burned right out of the gate, the mini-disc actually survived for nearly 2 decades. It outlived its highly funded immediate corporate rivals by more than 10 years. And in the process, it accidentally became this absolutely crucial bridge connecting the old physical media era straight to the modern digital MP3 era. It's this wild, fascinating story of corporate rivalry, accidental innovation, and sheer survival. Section 1. The cassette's dying days. To really wrap our heads around why the mini-disc even exists, we kind of have to travel back to the late 1980s and early 90s. At the time, Sony was sitting at the absolute top of the portable audio mountain. I mean, they invented the Walkman back in 1979, creating a whole new product category. And by 1990, they had a commanding lead, selling close to 200 model variations of the cassette Walkman. We're talking hundreds of millions of units. But behind closed doors, Sony's leadership was actually getting pretty nervous because the cassette tape, it was dying. They thoroughly understood this business concept called the technology S-curve. Basically, it's a model showing how any technology eventually hits its physical performance limits. You can pour millions of dollars into engineering, but at a certain point, you're only going to get tiny incremental improvements. Sony had been making tape recorders since 1950, so they knew the physical limits of magnetic tape better than anyone on Earth. They realized they just couldn't keep tweaking the cassette forever. So before that S-curve peaked entirely, they knew they needed a radical leap to a completely new technological curve. And this brilliantly illustrates the limits of that analog tape technology and why Sony was desperate to avoid getting stuck on that flattening upper curve. So Sony's president at the time, Norio Oga, made a really bold, aggressive move. He handed down an incredibly ambitious deadline. His engineers had to create a small, recordable, disc-based replacement for the audio cassette by November 1992. Why then? Because that was exactly the 10-year anniversary of the compact disc. Section 2. The Great Format War. But here's the thing. Sony wasn't the only tech giant trying to figure out what came after the cassette. Enter Philips. Now, 10 years earlier, Sony and Philips actually teamed up to invent the CD. But this time around, the impending death of the cassette triggered a massive battle for the future of digital audio. It became this epic war of evolution versus revolution. See, Philips took a very safe conservative strategy. They created the digital compact cassette, or DCC. It was a digital tape, but it was physically backwards compatible, meaning their brand new digital players could still play your dusty old analog tapes. Philips basically assumed consumers were just too heavily invested in their billions of old cassettes to abandon them. Sony, on the other hand, chose revolution. Inspired by President Oga's mandate, they placed a massive, risky bet on a completely new magneto-optical disc. No backwards compatibility at all. A total clean break from the past. Let's look at how these two formats stacked up in this 1992 showdown. Philips was using magnetic tape, while Sony was using an advanced magneto-optical disc. Now, Philips actually had an edge in audio quality right out of the gate with their PASC compression, which was practically flawless compared to a CD. Sony's ATRAC compression unfortunately sounded noticeably worse at launch. Philips gave you backward compatibility. Sony gave you exactly none. But look at that last row. This is where Sony had the real killer feature. Because DCC was tape, it had linear access. You literally had to physically fast forward to find a song. Because MiniDisc was optical, it offered random track access, just like a CD. You could skip tracks instantly. It was pure digital innovation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the corporate machine Sony activated to hit that brutal November 1992 deadline. President Oga elevated the MiniDisc to a corporate status project. And this diagram shows how they just pulled resources from everywhere to make it happen fast. They grabbed pure optical pickup technology from their CD division. They used a memory buffer technique from portable CDs just to stop the disc from skipping when you went for a jog. And amazingly, to shrink the electronics down in time, they actually borrowed monolithic microwave integrated circuits, or MICs, straight from a car navigation system project. No way, right? They integrated everything internally to completely out-innovate Philips.
Section 3, stumbling out the gate.
So they actually hit the deadline. Both the DCC and the MiniDisc hit the shelves in late 1992, but the global launch looked like a complete technological disaster outside of Japan, where, fun fact, the MiniDisc was actually a massive hit. But that staggering number right there is the primary reason why it struggled everywhere else. In North America, the initial price point for 1992-era MiniDisc hardware was between $800 and $1,000. It was completely out of reach for the casual listener. It alienated the average consumer immediately, leaving the format only affordable to high-end audiophiles, who ironically absolutely hated it because of those early compression issues we talked about. And the self-inflicted wounds, they didn't stop at the price tag. There were massive early pain points. That first version of ATRAC compression degraded the sound pretty noticeably. Plus, they hobbled the device with a digital rights management scheme called SCMS, which severely limited digital copying. Why would they do that? Well, because Sony, the electronics maker, was actually fighting internally with Sony, the music label. Sony Music was terrified of digital piracy, and that internal friction led to a massive lack of broad record label support. So yeah, the MiniDisc was really struggling. But to Sony's credit, they kept iterating. They kept improving the ATRAC algorithm and shrinking down the players. Meanwhile, Philips, they kept the DCC completely stagnant, and it quietly died a miserable death by 1996. So Sony had won the battle, but, with MP3s on the horizon, it really looked like they were going to lose the war.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds, saved by the PC.
Just as industry analysts were literally writing the MiniDisc's obituary in the late 90s, calling it a failure akin to the Betamax, the plot took a massive twist. Enter Exitel. This was an obscure Australian company selling sound cards to high-end PC gamers who wanted 3D surround sound. But Exitel noticed something really weird happening. Their sound cards had optical outputs, and suddenly they were completely selling out. Why? Because this underground community of MiniDisc devotees realized they could run an optical cable from this Exitel PC sound card directly into their MiniDisc recorders. This meant they could flawlessly, digitally record their downloaded MP3s straight to MiniDisc. It was just this brilliant, accidental grassroots innovation. Notice how rapidly the format evolved after this accidental integration. Once Exitel released a dedicated MD port in 1999, it accidentally tripled MiniDisc sales in North America in just a few months. That is insane. By early 2001, the MiniDisc was the #1 top-selling portable digital music player on the entire market. Sony finally woke up, partnered directly with Exitel, and completely pivoted their whole strategy. They integrated USB natively to create NetMD in 2001, which allowed super-fast transfers of MP3s. And then in 2004, they evolved it again into HiMD, boasting a massive 1 GB of storage. The rise of the PC, which was absolutely supposed to kill the MiniDisc, actually saved it.
Section 5, a legacy of destruction.
So the crucial point is, as we bring this explainer to its strategic conclusion, we really need to zoom out. Because beyond the cool hardware and the crazy format wars, there is a profoundly important business lesson hiding within the whole MiniDisc saga. And it's called creative destruction. Most companies are absolutely terrified of this concept. They do not want to kill their golden goose. But Sony? They bravely and intentionally cannibalized their own massive, highly profitable Walkman cassette empire just to survive the digital shift. They threw their own market completely into disequilibrium. And because they were willing to destroy their own product before someone else did, they built the exact technological competencies that allowed them to stay relevant. Which brings us to the ultimate truth about the format. The MiniDisc was not a failure. It was the absolute necessary bridge to the modern digital era. Sure, it never became the ubiquitous overnight cassette replacement that Sony originally dreamed of back in 1992. But it survived, and it genuinely thrived as a transition technology. It taught Sony and the rest of the world exactly how consumers wanted to interact with, edit, and carry around digital audio. It literally paved the way for everything that followed. The MiniDisc lived a long, truly fascinating life, officially ending production in 2011, long after the iPod had already taken over the world. But it leaves behind this incredible legacy of brilliant engineering and pure survival. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. In our modern era of invisible streaming files living in the cloud, what physical media do you still cling to and why? Let that sink in.
I'll see you next time.